This presentation is for the World Congress on Education, WCE 2017. Hello everyone, my name is Shefazila Omorali and I am from the University of Manchester under the School of Education, Environment and Development. My research interest is in the area of online learning, which is why in this conference I will be presenting on a concept that has had its fair share of discussions and criticisms. And that concept is digital natives. For this presentation, I will now be referring to some of my slides as a guide. Now, let's first clarify how digital natives are defined. According to Prensky, digital natives is a generation born after the 1980s, surrounded by and immersed in digital technologies such as computers, video games, cell phones, and other toys and tools of the digital age. We see more and more of this now with children glued to their devices and the spending of time surfing the internet or playing video games. Some might say that research on digital native has run its course. Now, I'm not going to argue against that. Even Prensky has moved on to the idea of digital wisdom. However, there exists an extensive body of literature on digital natives, studies that advocate it and studies that debunked it. My paper today represents neither of the two. What I will be presenting is instead a consolidation of several viewpoints, a systematic literature review of what has been contributed to the digital native discourse, concept papers, empirical studies supporting and refuting the concept, statistics and census on the use of digital technologies. This paper is an attempt to provide a new perspective to an argument that has been long-standing, and with the expansion to any solution. This can also be applicable to other countries, where observably the students are increasingly engaged with digital technology such as iPads, tablets, and smartphones. It is very simple and easy to conclude that we are dealing with digital natives. Or are we? This is the problem with this point of view. The digital native concept has been staunchly opposed and criticized in the literature, mainly based on its lack of empirical evidence. Bennett suggested that it is a flawed perspective because the idea of the digital native captured the imagination of teachers, parents, journalists, commentators, and academics, but one that is substantiated by anecdotes, conjectures, and speculation. This is just one of many articles, I'm referring to Bennett's article, that questioned the plausibility of the digital natives concept. In fact, according to Bennett, a significant body of international research has largely debunked the idea of a uniformly technically savvy generation. So for my context, what I decided to do was to gain a better understanding of who the Bruneian learners are. Are there really nativized users of digital technology? Or have we been spellbound by the moral panic that is digital native? For this review, the method employed by this literature review is structured and systematic. It follows a framework suggested by Booth and Papaionou called the SALSA framework, SALSA, which stands for Search, Appraisal, Synthesize, and Analyze. These are the 4 steps of their framework. The first process was creating an inclusion and exclusion criteria based on the scope of my study. For example, the search of literature was limited to the field of education, while other fields such as marketing and human resources were excluded. The second process was the actual search itself, which is part of the SALSA framework, the search. Searching the literature involved 3 search cycles. The first cycle was performed on the Google Scholar database, which comprehensively identified literature on digital natives and the keywords associated with this discourse, such as Nat Generation, or Generation Y, Echo Boomers, Millennials, and so on. These keywords became part of the inclusion-exclusion criteria. The second cycle of the search involved another comprehensive search of the Google Scholar database once more, but this time referring to the key search terms that were generated earlier. Upon exhaustion of the database, the key terms were used again, but with added Boolean logic. and whereupon key authors were identified as significantly contributing to the discourse. Their names were then used as search terms to identify related and sequential articles. The same systematic process performed on Google Scholar was replicated once more on the Scopus database. Together, the Google Scholar and the Scopus database, these accounted for 132 academic articles that were relevant to the discussion of digital natives. The comprehensiveness of this collection was cross-checked against a search on the Education Resource Information Center database, or ERIC. And it was found that a similar set of literature could be derived from Google Scholar, from Scopus, or from ERIC. Coming to the third cycle. The third cycle of the search was on grey literature, which eventually generated a large repository of data that ranged from speculative to empirically supported commentaries. Now, due to the subjective nature of this set of literature, the information attained were put aside only to be used as an adaptive reasoning mechanism to fill in the few gaps in the academic literature. So we done search and we move on to the appraisal. So the appraisal and the synthesis of these 132 pieces of literature were achieved through several platforms. Mendeley was used to categorize the literature. The significant points and summaries were then extracted to Microsoft Excel, and comparison between articles were then performed both on Microsoft Excel and also on ebook through manual annotations. My paper details how the data was extracted, tabulated, and filtered in detail, which allowed for not only comparing these articles but also in determining the significant contribution to the discussion on digital natives. Ultimately, from the 132 pieces of literature that were appraised, the process of synthesis narrowed the pool further down to 64 highly relevant literature. What came next in the SALSA framework, now we have done with the search part, the appraisal part, and the synthesis part, was the analysis of the 64 articles. And it is the analysis that contributes to the main discussion of my review in this paper. A holistic review was firstly done on the 64 articles, which alluded to the presence of studies that supports digital natives and studies that debunks digital natives. A small set of literature were beginning to allude to an alternative view beyond these two sides of the argument. And this is where I position myself in writing my review. The first argument that my review analyzed was the canon on the existence of digital natives. Do digital natives really exist? 16 of the 64 literature were based on empirical evidence, and what I did was conduct a mini meta-analysis of all these statistical-based papers. Of the 13 studies that were published to debunk the digital natives concept, I found that 8 were performed on university students, 2 involved middle and high school students, and 1 study had its youngest sampling frame as 20 years old and above. That's a minimum of 20 years old and above. Now, these debunking studies all had samples of young adults, and all of these studies presented statistics that showed these young adults as far from being digital natives, at times even struggling with digital technology. One study had a sample with an age range of 12 to 30 years old, within which several age ranges were distinguished. The study, like the previous ones that I mentioned, refuted the concept of digital natives by stating that when it comes to the generational differences for internet activities that were analyzed, it is shown that very few internet activities can be ascribed to the net generation or digital natives. However, what was noteworthy was that the same study also found that the younger sample of 12 to 16-year-olds scored highest in the self-efficacy measurement on the internet, which is supposedly a digital native trait, and possibly would have scored higher on the internet skills if they were asked about activities they would frequently engage in. In other words, because his youngest group were found to be most self-efficient, they are likely to engage with the internet on their own accord. independent, and nativized to the digital concept. From the literature, the few studies that did statistically conclude the presence of digital natives all had samples of younger age ranges compared to the studies that debunked the concept earlier. Based on this analysis, this review believes that the younger the sample, the higher the chances of encountering digital natives, as illustrated by this figure. Prensky made the statement on digital natives in 2001, and studies that debunked the concept used samples that were born literally as Prensky suggested after the 1980s. Studies that did not debunk digital natives had samples who at the time were younger and coincided with the exponential growth of digital technology that started in the mid-1990s with public access to the World Wide Web, the early 2000s with Web 2.0. Digital natives were not born into Usenet or bulletin board systems of the 80s, as Prensky suggested, because children didn't have casual access to these technologies. But digital natives are likely to be born into Web 2.0, Facebook, and YouTube and tablets and smartphones, because many are now literally exposed to them at a young age. Therefore, this review suggests that digital nativeness is correlated with technology advancement that a child is born in. That is very much different from the 1980s to the 1990s to the 2000s and the 2010s. We are currently now in the age of Web 3.0, and as child-friendly as it is now, there are still aspects of the internet that have steep learning curves. So it is likely that digital natives will indeed exist when born into a world of modern artificial intelligences, robotics, and ubiquitous computing of the future. But it's not going to be now. So the second argument of this review is the homogeneity of digital natives. The concept of digital natives has been criticized for its lumping of individuals into one homogeneous group, a group who happen to be born in the same generation and immersed in digital technology that eventually led them to develop a uniform competency. They all had the same level of competency. Now, studies that debunk this belief found no significant evidence of a homogeneous generation of individuals with technical expertise and distinctive learning style. Another study that debunked the concept found that a complex of minorities, most of whom engage in a wide range of technology uses with a high frequency, but who do not show a strong impulse towards the kind of participation and generational homogeneity predicted by next generation or digital native inspired literature. In other words, studies that have debunked digital natives base their conclusion on the varying levels of digital literacy and skills observed in the sample. Now, based on the findings of the previous argument, this review, however, believes that because the digital natives is a minority of a given student population, it can be interpreted that members of the student population have different trajectories toward reaching digital nativeness. Some may reach digital nativeness quicker than others. Those who are born later, who are younger, and born into more advanced technology may find the transition more intuitive. It is therefore realistic to expect that if studies are performed on students who are still in the continuum of acquiring and perfecting their digital skills, the empirical evidence will certainly highlight diversity in digital competence, as established by studies cited in my review. This review suggests that the current student population we have is comprised of students with different levels of competency. There's no denying that. But as younger students are born into emerging technologies and become part of the student population, we perhaps will see a convergence of these competencies and abilities to use digital technology. After all, human-computer interaction is converging into a uniform system. The Internet of Things, ubiquitous computing, artificial intelligence, all these emerging technologies. When digital competency become intuitive and intuitive skills at a young age, we may see a more homogeneous group a group of, eventually, digital natives? The answer is perhaps only a few are truly digital natives, if at all, a minority. But with the gradual and, let's say, exponential convergence of emerging technologies and the digitization of everything that we do, digital nativeness is seemingly an imminent outcome of our modern internet-enabled lives. Prensky is not wrong here about digital natives, but neither are those who rejected the concept. What it seems likely is that the digital native concept is just a concept far too ahead of its time.